In a small town where traditions run deep and prejudices linger, one young boy's act of kindness sparks a chain of events that will change everything. When a lonely boy saves a dying puppy, the town's shocking reaction will leave you speechless. Can kindness break the walls of prejudice and fear? Watch as one boy's courage changes a community forever. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Jamal walked home from school along the same worn path he always took, kicking a stray rock down the cracked sidewalk. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the small southern town in warm hues, but to him, the colors felt muted. The town, with its cobblestone streets and historic charm, had never quite embraced him. He was used to the way people looked at him, some with indifference, others with quiet judgment. He lived with his mother, Monica, in a modest house on the outskirts of town. She worked long shifts at the local diner, scraping together enough to keep the lights on and food on the table. Jamal understood struggle, but he also understood kindness. He had always felt drawn to animals, especially the ones others ignored. The town itself felt frozen in time, clinging to its traditions and unspoken rules. At the heart of it stood Mr. Harlan's general store, a place where old men gathered to sip coffee and share stories, and where Jamal knew he wasn't particularly welcome. Mr. Harlan, a grizzled war veteran with a permanent scowl, had lived in the town longer than most. He watched everything with sharp, scrutinizing eyes, and though he never said much to Jamal directly, the unspoken barrier between them was clear. As Jamal neared the alley between the barber shop and the pharmacy, a faint, desperate whimper made him stop. He turned his head, ears straining. Another sound, softer this time. He hesitated before stepping forward. The alley was littered with old crates, damp newspapers, and discarded wrappers. Then, tucked between a toppled trash can and a broken cardboard box, he saw it. A tiny, trembling puppy, ribs pressing against its skin, eyes dull with exhaustion. Jamal's heart clenched. Someone had left it here, abandoned it like trash. He crouched down, speaking softly. "Hey there, little guy," he whispered, extending a cautious hand. The puppy flinched, but didn't have the strength to move away. Carefully, Jamal scooped the frail creature into his arms. Its body was barely warm, and he could feel the rapid, weak beat of its heart. His mind raced. He knew he couldn't leave it here, but he also knew bringing it home wouldn't be easy. His mother had strict rules about strays, and their landlord didn't allow pets. He looked around the quiet street. The town had never been kind to outsiders, and he knew what people would think if they saw him with a stray trouble. But as the puppy let out another weak whimper, pressing its tiny nose into his sleeve, Jamal made his decision. He wasn't going to walk away. Jamal held the puppy close, feeling the frail rise and fall of its breath against his chest. Its tiny body was all bones beneath matted fur, its stomach sunken from hunger. The puppy's dull eyes blinked up at him, too weak to resist. He swallowed hard. He needed to get help, but how? His mother's voice echoed in his head. Asterisk no stray animals, Jamal. We barely have enough for ourselves. Asterisk, he knew bringing the puppy home wasn't an option. Still, he couldn't just leave it here. He glanced down the street and made a decision. Mr. Harlan's store was just a few blocks away. The old man had lived in town forever, and even though he was known for his gruff demeanor, Jamal had seen him tend to stray cats that lingered around the back of his shop. Maybe, just maybe, he would help. The bell above the store door jingled as Jamal stepped inside, the scent of tobacco and old wood filling his nose. Mr. Harlan stood behind the counter, adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped through a newspaper. He barely looked up when he spoke. "What do you want, boy?" Jamal hesitated, then carefully lifted the trembling puppy into view. "I found him in the alley. He's not doing so good. I thought maybe." "Not my problem." Mr. Harlan cut him off, lowering the newspaper just enough to look Jamal in the eye. "But you help animals," Jamal pressed. "I help the ones that belong to folks around here." Mr. Harlan's voice was flat, his gaze hard. "That ain't one of them." Jamal's grip on the puppy tightened. "But he's starving. He won't make it through the night. Then let nature do what it does." The words hit Jamal like a slap. He stared at Mr. Harlan, waiting for any sign of softness in the man's face. There was none. "Now get out of my store," Mr. Harlan said, returning to his paper. Jamal's jaw clenched as he turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. His chest burned with frustration, but he had no time to dwell on it. He needed another plan. The vet clinic was a 10-minute walk away. Dr. Phillips was the only veterinarian in town, and though Jamal didn't know him well, he figured the man wouldn't turn away a helpless puppy. By the time he reached a small brick building, the sky had begun to darken. Jamal ran up the steps and tugged at the door handle, locked. His stomach sank. He peered through the window, but the lights inside were off. A small sign on the door read, * closed. Will return Monday, *. Monday. That was 2 days away. He had no money, no help, and nowhere to take the puppy. Jamal looked down at the tiny creature in his arms. The puppy let out a soft whimper, pressing its wet nose against his hand as if sensing his despair. Jamal exhaled, his mind racing. He had only one option left. Sneaking through the back gate, he slipped into a small backyard, careful not to make noise. Their shed, an old wooden structure filled with broken tools and storage bins, would have to do. He nudged the door open and stepped inside, setting the puppy down on a pile of old rags. "There," he whispered. "You'll be safe here." The puppy curled into a tight ball, its eyes fluttering closed. Jamal reached into his pocket and pulled out the half-eaten sandwich from his lunch. He tore off small pieces, gently placing them in front of the puppy. It sniffed hesitantly before weakly nibbling at the food. Jamal smiled for the first time that evening. "I'm going to take care of you," he whispered. "You're not alone anymore." As he watched the puppy eat, a name came to him. "Lucky," he murmured. "That's what I'll call you." For the first time in a long while, Jamal felt like he was doing something that mattered. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Jamal barely slept. Every few hours, he checked on Lucky, making sure the puppy was warm and fed. The little dog still looked weak, but at least he was safe. Or so Jamal thought. The next morning, as he tiptoed out to the shed with a small bowl of milk, he heard the sharp gasp before he saw her. His mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes flashing with fury. "Jamal," Monica's voice was tight. "What is this?" Jamal froze. Lucky, as if sensing the tension, let out a tiny whimper and tried to stand. Monica stepped closer, her face pale with worry. "Tell me you didn't bring a stray into this house." Jamal swallowed hard. "Mama," he was dying. "I couldn't just leave him." Her hands went to her temples, rubbing as if trying to hold back a headache. "Jamal, do you have any idea what you've done?" "It's just a puppy." "It's never just anything in this town," she snapped. "What happens when the neighbors find out? When the landlord hears barking? We don't get second chances, Jamal." Jamal's stomach twisted. He knew what she meant. The town had rules, unspoken ones. Rules that made it clear who belonged and who didn't. And people like them, people who didn't fit the mold, had to be careful. "I'll keep him quiet," Jamal pleaded. "Please, Mama. Just a little longer." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed, her expression softening just slightly. "I know you've got a big heart," she murmured, "but kindness don't pay rent, and it sure won't protect you from this town." Jamal felt his throat tighten. "So you're saying I have to get rid of him?" Her jaw clenched. "Before morning." With that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Jamal standing in the doorway, his heart sinking. That night, the storm rolled in without warning. Rain hammered against the tin roof of the shed, and thunder rattled the windows. Jamal wrapped Lucky in an old towel, but the little dog trembled violently. His breathing was labored, and he barely lifted his head. Something was wrong. Jamal's chest tightened. Was it the cold? The hunger from being abandoned for too long? He didn't know. He just knew that if he didn't do something, Lucky wouldn't make it until morning. He couldn't just sit here and watch him fade away. Heart pounding, he made up his mind. He had to get help. Slipping on his hoodie, he tucked Lucky against his chest and pushed open the back door. The rain hit him like icy needles, drenching him instantly. He pulled his hood low and ran, his shoes splashing through puddles as he headed toward the only place he could think of, Dr. Phillips' clinic. The wind howled through the empty streets. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift, making his pulse race. He gritted his teeth and pushed forward. Then, a pair of headlights flicked on ahead, cutting through the downpour. Jamal froze. The vehicle rumbled closer, its beams slicing through the night. Someone had spotted him. His breath caught as the truck sped up. Jamal turned to run, and the scene cuts to black. The truck's headlights bore down on Jamal. His breath caught in his throat. His feet slipped on the rain-slick pavement as he scrambled toward the alley. But before he could disappear into the shadows, the truck skidded to a stop beside him. The door swung open, and a heavy boot landed in a puddle with a splash. Jamal Carter. Jamal's stomach twisted. He knew that voice. Sheriff Boyd. The town's lawman wasn't a bad man, exactly, but he wasn't a friend either. He had a way of looking at Jamal like he was always 2 seconds away from trouble. Jamal clutched Lucky tighter against his chest. His hoodie pulled low over his face as he tried to steady his breathing. "What are you doing out here this late?" the sheriff asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Jamal's mind raced. He couldn't say he was sneaking out to help a sick puppy. Not in this town. Not when his mother had warned him of exactly this kind of trouble. I was just going home," he stammered. Got caught in the rain. Sheriff Boyd narrowed his eyes. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight at Jamal's chest. The beam caught the edges of Lucky's soaked fur. The puppy let out a faint whimper, and Jamal's arms instinctively tightened. The sheriff's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not up to something, are you?" Jamal shook his head quickly. "No, sir." A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the pounding rain. Finally, Sheriff Boyd grunted and jerked his head toward the road. "Get on home." Jamal nodded, forcing himself to walk, not run, until he was out of sight. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. That was too close. By morning, Lucky wasn't moving much. His tiny body was hot to the touch, and his shallow breathing made panic claw at Jamal's chest. He needed help. But who? His mother had made it clear. He couldn't count on her. The vet was still closed. And Mr. Harlan? That wasn't even an option. Then it hit him. Ms. Rowe. She was his science teacher, one of the only adults in town who didn't treat him like an outsider. She'd once brought in her old dog for a biology lesson and talked about how she used to volunteer at an animal shelter. Maybe she would help. But how could he ask her without getting caught? Jamal chewed his lip, then glanced at his backpack. He hated the idea, but he had no choice. Sneaking Lucky into school was the most nerve-wracking thing Jamal had ever done. He wrapped the puppy in a sweatshirt and cradled him in his backpack, leaving the zipper slightly open for air. Every time Lucky let out a weak whimper, Jamal's heart nearly stopped. By the time he made it to Ms. Rowe's classroom, his nerves were shot. He waited until the other students left for lunch, then hurried to her desk. She looked up, surprised. "Jamal? What's wrong?" He hesitated, then slowly unzipped his bag, revealing the sickly pup inside. Ms. Rowe's eyes widened. "Oh, Jamal? I didn't know who else to go to," he blurted. "He's really sick, and I don't have money, and the vet's closed, and—" Ms. Rowe held up a hand, her face soft with understanding. "Slow down. She reached out and gently touched Lucky's head. Her brow furrowed. He's dehydrated. Malnourished, too. He needs fluids and warmth. Jamal swallowed. Can you help him? She hesitated. He saw the conflict in her eyes. Helping Jamal meant getting involved, and getting involved in his problems wasn't something most people in town were willing to do. But after a long pause, she sighed and stood. Stay here. Jamal held his breath as she walked to her supply cabinet, rummaging through shelves before pulling out an old towel, a small bottle, and some powder formula. This isn't much, she said, handing them to him, but it should help for now. Jamal exhaled, gripping the supplies like they were gold. Thank you, Ms. Rowe, he whispered. Her expression softened. I'm proud of you for caring so much, Jamal. But be careful. She hesitated, lowering her voice. People talk in this town, and she was right, because by the end of the day, word had already started to spread. The small town thrived on whispers, and by noon, the rumors had spread like wildfire. By the time Jamal got home, Monica was already waiting, her arms crossed and her jaw tight. What did I tell you? She demanded, her voice low but sharp. Mr. Harlan came by the diner today. Said you've been running around town with a sick stray, bothering people for help. Jamal's stomach dropped. Mama, it's not like that. She cut him off, pacing the kitchen. You don't understand, Jamal. This isn't just about a dog. This town, these people, they watch. They judge. They remember every little thing. She turned to him, eyes filled with worry. And they don't forget when people like us step out of line. Jamal clenched his fists. But I didn't do anything wrong. Monica's shoulders slumped. I know, baby, but that doesn't always matter. Silence hung between them. Then, more gently, she asked, where is he now? In the shed, Jamal said. I've been keeping him quiet, I swear. Monica sighed, rubbing her temples. Just keep your head down, okay? And don't let anyone see you with that dog again. Jamal nodded, but deep down, something in him refused to shrink away. Lucky wasn't just some stray. He wasn't going to let this town decide what he could and couldn't care about. The trouble started after school. Jamal had barely stepped onto the sidewalk when he heard the familiar voice drawl behind him. Well, if it isn't the little hero, Jamal tensed. Todd Harrelson. He turned slowly. Todd stood with his usual group. ***, Jake, Levi, and Brent ***, all dressed in their clean, expensive clothes, looking down at him like he was something beneath their boots. Todd smirked. Heard you took in some pathetic mutt. Jamal set his jaw. So, what? Jake snorted. Didn't know you liked trash, Carter. Jamal's hands curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was how it always was. Boys like Todd pushing, prodding, waiting for him to snap so they could turn around and act like he was the problem. Todd took a slow step forward, his voice mockingly sympathetic. You know, strays don't last long in this town. Nobody wants them. Eventually, someone's got to clean up the mess. Jamal's heart pounded. Leave him alone. Todd tilted his head, pretending to consider it. Or what? Jamal held his ground, staring Todd down. For a second, something flickered in Todd's expression. Then he scoffed, rolling his shoulders. Relax, Carter. I wouldn't waste my time on a mutt, he said, voice dripping with fake innocence. Then, with one last smirk, he turned and walked off, his friends laughing behind him. Jamal didn't trust it. Something about Todd's tone had felt too casual, too certain. And later that night, his worst fears came true. Jamal stepped into the shed and froze. The old wooden crate where Lucky had been resting was overturned. The blankets were scattered. The small dish of water was kicked across the floor. And Lucky was gone. Panic surged through Jamal's chest. His breath hitched as he frantically searched the tiny space. Lucky? Silence. The shed door creaked in the wind. Jamal's hands shook as realization set in. Someone had taken him, and he had a pretty good idea who. Jamal stormed across the schoolyard the next morning, his heart pounding with anger and fear. He spotted Todd near the parking lot, laughing with Jake and Levi like nothing had happened. Jamal didn't hesitate. He marched straight up to him. "Where is he?" Todd barely glanced at him. "What? You know what I'm talking about," Jamal snapped. "Where's Lucky?" Todd smirked, shaking his head. "Man, I told you, I don't waste my time on strays." Jamal's fist clenched. "You were the last one talking about him, and now he's gone." Todd shrugged. "Maybe he ran off. Maybe he's roadkill by now." Jamal saw red. He lunged forward, shoving Todd back a step. The laughter around them stopped. Todd's smirk faded, replaced by something darker. His jaw tensed as he stepped closer, chest puffed. "You sure you want to do this, Carter?" Before Jamal could say anything, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." Jamal turned to see Sheriff Boyd, arms crossed, eyes cold. He took slow steps toward them, scanning the scene before settling his gaze on Jamal. "Something wrong here?" Jamal swallowed hard. "Someone took my dog." The sheriff arched an eyebrow. "That's so." He turned to Todd. "You know anything about this?" Todd scoffed. "Nope." Boyd nodded like he expected that answer. Then he turned back to Jamal. "Listen, son," he said, voice level. "You're walking a fine line, stirring up trouble, throwing around accusations." He leaned in slightly. "This town don't take kindly to that." Jamal's stomach twisted. This wasn't just about Lucky. It was about who he was, who they saw him as. Sheriff Boyd didn't care about the truth. He just wanted Jamal to stay quiet. Jamal looked at Todd, who was grinning now. He had no power here. Shoulders stiff, Jamal turned and walked away. But he wasn't giving up. Not yet. That night, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched dinner. Monica watched him carefully. "Jamal, I know you're upset, but there's nothing we can do." He barely heard her. His mind raced with thoughts of Lucky, hurt, scared, alone. He imagined the worst. Then a soft shuffling sound. A small envelope slid under the front door. Jamal froze. His chair scraped loudly against the floor as he rushed to grab it, heart hammering. There was no name, just a single line, written in jagged letters. "If you care about that mutt, meet me at the old barn at midnight." Jamal's breath caught. A trap? A setup? Or his only chance? He had to go. The old barn stood at the edge of town, its wooden frame warped and broken by time. The wind howled through the cracks as Jamal stepped inside, his flashlight beam sweeping over dust-covered beams and rotting hay bales. Then movement. Jamal's pulse quickened. He turned sharply, light landing on a figure standing near the back. His breath hitched. Mr. Harlan, and at his feet, Lucky. Jamal rushed forward, but Harlan held up a hand. "Easy, boy." Jamal skidded to a stop, panting. Lucky lay on an old blanket, whimpering softly. His fur was ruffled, and there was a fresh scrape along his hind leg. Jamal's fist tightened. "You took him." Mr. Harlan studied him, eyes unreadable. "Figured I'd see how much fight you had in you." Jamal's stomach twisted. "What?" The old man sighed, crouching beside Lucky, running a callous hand over his back. "I want to know if you were just some foolish kid, or if you really had it in you to stand up for him." Jamal's chest burned. "You think this was some kind of test?" His voice shook. "He could have died." Mr. Harlan didn't flinch. "But he didn't, and you didn't give up on him." Jamal's hands balled into fists. "Why would you do this?" A long silence stretched between them. Then Harlan's expression shifted just slightly. "Because once upon a time, someone tested me, too." Jamal's breath caught. The town's gruff, unshakable war veteran. Asterisk, asterisk, he understood asterisk, asterisk. And he had been watching all along. The barn was silent, except for Lucky's soft whimpers. Jamal dropped to his knees beside him, gently cradling his tiny body. and for the first time in days, he let out a shaky breath of relief. Jamal sat on the cold barn floor, cradling Lucky against his chest. The puppy whimpered softly, nuzzling into his arms, exhausted but alive. Relief flooded Jamal, but his anger still simmered beneath the surface. Mr. Harlan leaned against a wooden post, arms crossed, watching him with unreadable eyes. The old man wasn't as gruff as usual. Something about him seemed softer. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "My wife used to take in strays," he muttered, almost to himself. Didn't matter if they were sick, ugly, or half dead. She couldn't turn her back on them. Jamal looked up, surprised. Mr. Harlan never talked about his wife. She'd find him on the side of the road, abandoned, thrown out like garbage. Harlan continued, his voice quieter now. And she'd patch him up one by one. Drove me crazy. He let out a low chuckle. Didn't see the point back then. Figured a stray was just a stray. His gaze flickered to Jamal, eyes sharp. But I see it now. Jamal's grip on Lucky tightened. People like you and her, you got something and you the rest of us don't. Jamal swallowed hard. Does that mean you're gonna help me? Harlan sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. Ain't gonna be easy. That pup's weak, and I ain't no vet. But I know a thing or two. He disappeared into the back of the barn and returned with an old metal tin. Inside were bandages, ointments, and a small bottle of milk. Jamal watched as the old man carefully cleaned Lucky's wound, his rough hands unexpectedly gentle. For the first time, Jamal saw Mr. Harlan not as a cranky, unapproachable man, but as someone who understood, maybe even someone who cared. The next morning, Jamal woke up feeling lighter than he had in days. Lucky was safe. Mr. Harlan was helping, but as soon as he stepped outside, his stomach dropped. Something was wrong. The air was thick with tension. Neighbors stood in tight clusters, whispering. Some threw glances his way, before quickly looking away. Jamal's pulse quickened. At school, the stares were worse. Even Ms. Rowe, usually warm and encouraging, seemed tense when she saw him. By lunchtime, he finally heard the whispers for himself. Heard he stole that dog. Probably just trying to stir up trouble. His mama must be mortified. Jamal's hands curled into fists. The town thought he had stolen Lucky. That evening, his worst fears came true. Monica sat at the kitchen table, her face tight with worry. Sheriff Boyd stood in the doorway, his hat low over his eyes. "We got a problem," the sheriff said, voice slow and deliberate. "Folks in town are talking." Jamal stood frozen. Talking about what? Boyd adjusted his belt. "Some say you took that dog from where it belonged." Jamal's heart pounded. "That's a lie. He was abandoned. I found him." Boyd shrugged. "Might be. Might not be. But people are uneasy. And when people get uneasy, they start pointing fingers." Monica stood, stepping between them. "My son didn't steal anything." Boyd sighed. "Look, Miss Carter, I'm just here to warn you. This ain't about a dog anymore. It's about how this town sees things. And right now, they see trouble." Monica's jaw tightened. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying it'd be best if the boy learned to let things go." Jamal felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Let it go? Just stand by and let them twist the truth? Monica held his gaze, silently pleading with him to be careful. But Jamal had already made his decision. He wasn't backing down. Jamal sat on the porch, staring out at the town that suddenly felt like an enemy. The sheriff's warning echoed in his mind. Asterisk, asterisk, this ain't about a dog anymore. Lucky lay curled beside him, his tiny chest rising and falling. He was stronger now, but not out of danger. If the town turned against them, Jamal might lose him for good. He needed a plan. If people thought he was a troublemaker, he had to prove them wrong. If they thought Lucky was just some mutt, he had to show them his worth. And if they thought he was stealing from the town, he had to make them see his heart instead. Then it hit him. He rushed inside, grabbed a notebook and started scribbling ideas. His fingers trembled, but his mind was clear. This wasn't just about Lucky anymore. This was about changing the story. The next morning, Jamal stood outside Ms. Rowe's classroom, heart pounding. She was his last hope. When she saw him at the door, her expression softened, but there was something cautious in her eyes. "Jamal," she said gently, "I heard what happened." He took a deep breath. "Ms. Rowe, I need your help." She hesitated, glancing around. "I want to put together an adoption day," he said quickly, "for strays, for dogs like Lucky. If people see him and other animals needing homes, maybe they'll stop thinking I stole him. Maybe they'll care." Ms. Rowe blinked. "An adoption event?" Jamal nodded. "We could set up a booth at the town square. Let people meet the dogs, learn about rescue work. I could talk about Lucky's story, show them the truth." Ms. Rowe looked thoughtful. "That's actually a great idea, Jamal." His heart leaped, but then she frowned. "You do realize this won't be easy, right? A lot of people are already convinced you're in the wrong." Jamal straightened his shoulders. "Then I'll prove I'm not." She studied him for a moment, then slowly nodded. "All right, I'll help, but we need permission from the town council, and you'll need support." Jamal exhaled, nodding. "I'll find it." His next stop was the hardest. Mr. Harlan's store. The old man sat behind the counter, flipping through a newspaper, but he didn't look up when Jamal walked in. "I need your help," Jamal said, standing tall. Harlan turned a page. "I already helped you, boy." Jamal took a breath. "Not just for Lucky, for the town." That made Harlan pause. His eyes flicked up, studying Jamal carefully. "I'm organizing an adoption event," Jamal explained. "If people see Lucky, if they meet the other dogs, they'll understand. But I need supplies. Food, water bowls, leashes." Harlan leaned back in his chair. "And you think if I back this, people will come?" Jamal hesitated. "I think if you show up, people might listen." A long silence stretched between them. Then, to Jamal's shock, Mr. Harlan let out a low chuckle. "You're a stubborn kid. I'll give you that." Jamal waited, barely breathing. Finally, the old man sighed. "All right, I'll get you some supplies, and I'll come by. But don't expect me to make no speeches." A slow grin spread across Jamal's face. "Deal." But not everyone wanted Jamal to succeed. From across the street, Todd watched, arms crossed, jaw tight. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered. "Now, he's some kind of hero." Levi shifted beside him. "People are talking. Even my dad said it's impressive." Todd scowled. Jamal was supposed to be a nobody, a joke. Now, thanks to that stupid mutt, people were actually respecting him. And Todd couldn't let that happen. "We'll see how long this little act lasts," he muttered. A cruel smile crept onto his face. It was time to remind Jamal exactly where he stood. The sun rose over the town square, casting a golden glow over the carefully arranged adoption booth. Jamal stood back, taking in the scene with a mix of excitement and nerves. Rows of makeshift kennels lined the space, each holding a rescued dog waiting for a second chance. A small crowd had gathered, some curious, some skeptical. Ms. Rowe busied herself setting up informational pamphlets, while Mr. Harlan stood near a stack of donated supplies, arms crossed, grumbling about the heat but still there. Jamal knelt beside Lucky's crate, stroking the puppy's fur. "This is it, buddy," he whispered. "We show them who you really are." But somewhere in the crowd, Todd was watching. His fists clenched as he listened to people murmur about Jamal's efforts. His father, a well-respected businessman, had even donated money to support the cause, claiming it was good for the community. Todd seethed. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Jamal wasn't supposed to be the town's hero. Not after everything. A cruel idea flickered to life in his mind. If Jamal wanted to play the savior, Todd would make sure he had nothing left to save. The event was in full swing when it happened. A loud crash echoed through the square, followed by frantic barking. Jamal whipped around just in time to see the kennel gates swinging open, puppies spilling into the street, scattering in all directions. People screamed, chasing after them as the town erupted into chaos. "What the?" Ms. Rowe gasped, running toward the kennels. Jamal's stomach dropped. Someone had let them loose. And then he saw him, Todd, standing near the overturned crates, a satisfied smirk tugging at his lips. Jamal's hands curled into fists. "Todd, what did you do?" Todd just shrugged. Guess they didn't want to be caged. Jamal barely heard him. He was already running, scanning the chaos for Lucky. Dogs darted between legs and under carts, knocking over baskets and sending people stumbling. He barely noticed the commotion as his heart pounded in his ears. Where was Lucky? And then he heard it, a pained yell. Jamal skidded to a stop and turned toward the alley behind the square. Todd, trapped. A stack of wooden crates had collapsed, pinning Todd's leg. His face was twisted in pain, his usual arrogance gone. Jamal hesitated. This was his moment. He could walk away. Let Todd feel helpless for once. Let him suffer like Jamal had suffered under his cruelty. And yet he didn't move. He saw Todd's face twist, not just with pain, but with fear. Jamal knew that feeling. He took a step forward, then another, and then he was ripping away the crates, ignoring the weight pressing against his arms, ignoring the burn in his muscles. Todd let out a gasp as Jamal freed his leg. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Todd shaken, Jamal breathless. Jamal could have said anything, could have thrown Todd's cruelty back at him. But all he said was, "Can you stand?" Todd swallowed hard, nodded. Jamal helped him up. The town was still watching. They had seen everything. The dust slowly settled over the town square as the chaos of the runaway puppies began to subside. Jamal stood, still catching his breath, beside Todd, who leaned heavily against the crates, his face pale with pain but also marked by something new, something Jamal hadn't expected to see. Shocked, Todd looked up at Jamal, his usual bravado stripped away. You helped me." Jamal didn't say anything, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline, but his eyes never left Todd's. He didn't need to say more. Todd knew, now, the kind of person Jamal was. The kind of person who would choose to help his enemy, even when it was the hardest thing to do. And in that moment, something shifted, not just between them, but in the eyes of everyone watching. Sheriff Boyd, who had been standing off to the side, his arms crossed in judgment, now stepped forward. His sharp eyes locked onto Jamal. "You did good, son," Boyd said, his voice unusually soft. "I was wrong about you." The words were simple, but to Jamal, they felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. The sheriff had been a symbol of authority, a reminder of all the bias and assumptions that had been leveled at him. And now, for the first time, he was seeing Jamal for who he truly was. A boy with courage, with a big heart, and with the strength to change things. Jamal looked at the sheriff, his voice steady. "I just did what was right." The sheriff nodded, a rare smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sometimes, that's all it takes. The town, which had been divided, now seemed to breathe in unison. People who had whispered behind Jamal's back, who had dismissed his actions as reckless, were now watching him differently. One by one, they began to approach. First Ms. Rowe, with her gentle smile, then Mr. Harlan, who, despite his gruff exterior, had been moved by the boy's determination. "We got a place for that puppy now," Mr. Harlan muttered, his voice thick with emotion. Jamal smiled. "It's not just my puppy anymore. It's everyone's." As the afternoon sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the square, the town square was transformed. The puppy adoption event had become something far greater than Jamal had ever imagined, a symbol of unity, of redemption, and of change. Lucky, still a little unsure, but stronger now, was gently placed in the arms of Jamal's mother, Monica, who had watched everything unfold from the sidelines. Her eyes glistened as she met Jamal's gaze. "I always knew you had it in you." Jamal, overwhelmed, nodded. "It's not just me. It's all of us." One by one, the other puppies were adopted by families in the town, but Lucky, the symbol of the change, was finally taken home by Jamal and Monica, officially adopted not just by them, but by the entire community. It was the kind of change that Jamal had only dreamed about. A change that started with a small, vulnerable puppy but had transformed an entire town. As the sun set, casting the town in a warm, golden light, Jamal looked around at the people who had once judged him, now standing beside him. The town had finally seen him, seen his strength and his heart, and in doing so, they had seen themselves too. Jamal smiled, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed that he was exactly where he was meant to be, with his family, with his community, and with Lucky, the puppy who had given him the chance to show the world that kindness could heal even the deepest divides. And in the end, that was the real victory. In the days that followed the adoption event, the town felt different, like something that had been broken was starting to heal. The scars of the past, though still visible, seemed to fade a little with every gesture, every word of understanding exchanged between the townspeople. Jamal, as he walked through the streets, could feel the change. The once wary glances now felt warmer. The whispers behind his back, once full of judgment, now seemed to carry a hint of respect. And through it all, Jamal remained the same, a quiet force of compassion, always looking for ways to make the world around him better. One afternoon, as he was helping Ms. Rowe organize supplies for a new round of pet adoptions, he saw Mr. Harlan approach him. The old man had been a figure of constant tension in Jamal's life, always eyeing him with suspicion, his eyes filled with years of entrenched prejudice. But today was different. Today, there was no scowl, no harsh words. Jamal looked up as Mr. Harlan stopped in front of him, his face softening. The war veteran's voice, usually gruff and detached, now trembled with something deeper. Remorse. I owe you an apology, Jamal, Mr. Harlan said quietly. I've seen the way you fought for what's right, and I can't ignore it anymore. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. But what you've done, it's more than I ever expected from a boy your age. Jamal was stunned. This wasn't the man he had grown up seeing. The one who had always turned his back, who had always scoffed at him. But here he was, extending a hand, not just an apology, but in solidarity. I was wrong to judge you, Mr. Harlan continued, and I want to make it right. If you're willing, I could use your help around my shop. Take care of some of the animals. Learn a thing or two about running the place. Maybe it'll show you how much I've changed. Jamal's heart swelled. It wasn't just an apology. It was a bridge being built, a genuine opportunity. I'd like that, Jamal said softly, the words carrying more weight than he expected. Thank you. It was a moment that spoke volumes. Not just about Mr. Harlan, but about the power of acknowledging one's mistakes. It was a recognition that change didn't just happen because of big gestures. It often began with small, personal acts of courage, like an apology and a willingness to learn. Elsewhere in the town, Todd was still struggling with his pride. He had apologized, and Jamal had chosen to help him, but the guilt gnawed at Todd. There was no immediate path to redemption, no easy way to undo the hurt he had caused. One afternoon, as Jamal was leaving the shop, he saw Todd sitting by the park, his gaze distant. "Hey!" Jamal called, walking over. Todd looked up, his usual swagger replaced by an uncomfortable humility. "I don't know how to fix it, Jamal. I messed up, big time, and I don't know how to undo everything I've done." Jamal sat beside him, sensing the weight of Todd's internal struggle. You don't have to fix everything in one day. Redemption takes time. Todd nodded, his face still tense, but the wall that had once been there seemed to crumble, piece by piece. "I'm trying to be better," he admitted, "but I guess I don't know where to start." Jamal looked at him. "Start by being honest with yourself. And then, one step at a time, show people that you're different. It wasn't a perfect ending. Redemption wasn't a clean break. It was messy, filled with stumbles and setbacks. But in that moment, Todd understood something profound. That change was possible, not in grand gestures, but in the small, everyday decisions that led to a more honest, better self. As the days turned into weeks, the town began to find a new rhythm. The puppies that had once scattered to the streets now found their homes. Adopted by families who had witnessed firsthand how a small act of kindness could ripple out and change an entire community. The Puppy Adoption Day, despite its chaotic start, became more than just an event. It became a symbol of unity, a reminder of how even the smallest actions could create waves of transformation. Monica, Jamal's mother, was among the first to recognize it. She watched as people who had once kept their distance now greeted her with smiles and nods. "We did it, Jamal," she said, pride in her voice. "We really did it." Jamal, for the first time in his life, felt that he belonged, that he had created something lasting, something that could never be erased. His act of kindness, simple though it seemed, had given the town a reason to come together. And that, in the end, was the lesson. Change isn't about being perfect. It's about choosing to act with integrity and kindness, no matter how difficult it is. It's about recognizing that each of us has the power to make a difference, no matter our age, our race, or our background. The world may never be without its struggles, but with each small act of goodness, we can build a future that's just a little bit better, one step at a time. In Jamal's case, that step had been with a puppy named Lucky, and it had sparked a transformation that would last a lifetime. The sun dipped lower behind the horizon, casting a golden hue over the small town. The familiar streets, once lined with judgmental eyes, now seemed to glow with warmth and possibility. Jamal walked slowly, his hand gently holding the leash of Lucky, the puppy who had started it all. With each step, the whispers that had once followed him seemed to fade, replaced by smiles and nods of recognition. As he passed the general store, Mr. Harlan gave him a nod of approval, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. Across the street, Ms. Rowe, the teacher who had supported him from the start, waved with a smile. Even Sheriff Boyd, once a symbol of authority that Jamal had never quite felt he could trust, gave a small wave as he leaned against his patrol car. The town, in all its quiet, simple beauty, had transformed. Jamal had not just survived the challenges he faced, he had changed them, and in doing so, he had changed himself. He was no longer the boy who was seen as an outsider, an outcast, no longer the one who was unseen, misunderstood, or underestimated. Today, he was a young man who had proven his worth, not through defiance, but through the quiet strength of his resilience, his kindness, and his unwavering belief in doing what was right. Monica, who had once feared for her son's future, now walked beside him, her gaze filled with a pride she had never known before. She had worried about how the world would treat Jamal, but now she saw him not just as her child, but as a beacon of hope for a town that was finally learning to see him for who he truly was, a young man of character, compassion, and courage. Together, they walked toward the park, where a few of the neighborhood children were playing. Their eyes followed Jamal and Lucky, but now there was no sneer, no teasing, just quiet admiration. One child even ran up to Jamal, asking if they could pet Lucky. Jamal smiled and nodded, letting the child crouch down to gently stroke the puppy's fur. As the day drew to a close, Jamal found a quiet spot at the edge of town, just beneath a large oak tree. He and Lucky sat side by side, watching the sunset in peaceful silence. The sky was streaked with hues of orange, pink, and purple, and for the first time in a long time, Jamal felt a sense of calm settle over him. The town, once divided, had learned to embrace change. The judgments and prejudices that had weighed heavily on Jamal were now replaced by something far more powerful. Asterisk, asterisk, acceptance, asterisk, asterisk. It had taken time, effort, and sacrifice, but in the end, kindness and perseverance had triumphed over fear and misunderstanding. As Jamal looked up at the sunset, with Lucky by his side, he understood something profound. The journey had been long, but it had led him to a place of peace. Justice, redemption, and kindness, the values that had guided him from the beginning, had finally found their way home. In that moment, he knew that he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for the town, for his family, and for anyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. The future was still uncertain, but he was no longer afraid. He had found his place in the world, and he was ready for whatever came next. As the last rays of the sun slipped below the horizon, Jamal stood up, smiling down at Lucky. Together, they walked back toward town side by side, knowing that the road ahead was theirs to shape, one step at a time, with hope and kindness as their guiding light.